this for the second time, so you have to excuse me. I just wanted to say a couple opening remarks, and we're going to have Governor Holton speak for about 30 minutes or so, and then hopefully we'll have you all ask a few questions about things that you'd like to learn more about after his remarks. So, as I said earlier this morning, it's a great honor to have a former governor of Virginia speak to one of my classes. I have never had the opportunity to introduce a former governor in my classes before, either here or anywhere else, and so it's a distinction, it's a pleasure, and as I said earlier, a great honor to introduce former governor of Virginia, Linwood Holton, to you all and to the University of Richmond audience. And so if you would join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. We have a little voice trouble today, which is uncommon for me, but I'm delighted to be here. Particularly enjoy talking to college students and in this group particularly because you are studying about a period in the history in which I participated. It was a great challenge and a lot of fun, and for both me and my family. And I want you to feel as informal as you can about this. I don't want to filibuster you. And I'd like you to interrupt me and ask questions anytime you want to. I'll give you a little background though and try to do a little less talking than I did last time so it'll leave more room for questions. I'm not one of those Republicans who is written about so often in the newspaper and on the television today. I'm a moderate Republican, which may be a dying breed, and certainly the Republicans that I grew up with were the progressive members of the political establishment in Virginia. It came to me against a background of absolute domination by one faction of the Democratic Party. When I came back from the Pacific, where I was in the tail end of World War II, in 1946, it was impressed on me that Bill Tuck, who was then governor, had been elected governor of Virginia with 8% of the registered vote, which implied that there just wasn't any interest in statewide elections or in the state government. And I determined to break up that monopoly. After going to law school and coming back to Roanoke, which I chose, it was not my home. I grew up in Big Stone Gap, out in the far west of the corner of Virginia, in the coal fields. But I chose Roanoke because it had a population of something in there, metropolitan area of over 100,000 people. It represented a large enough group that I felt there was a base on which you could build a Republican Party. It was a newer city, founded in 1892. Didn't have in its tradition the background of the Civil War and the slavery and Democratic Party participation as Richmond and Lynchburg had. And therefore I chose Roanoke as being a place where you could build a Republican Party. I didn't care as much about the ideology of the Republican Party as I did about the fact of a two-party system, a vehicle, which you could create competitive political situation so that folks could choose in an election whether they wanted this one or that. It came to be a theme of mine as I ran first for the House of Delegates and then the Senate and finally twice for governor, to compare that two-party philosophy to a two-drugstore town. If you lived in a small town that had two drugstores, you could get your prescription filled when you had when you needed it filled. If you lived in a one drugstore town, you could only get that prescription filled when the druggist got ready to fill it. The competition forced the service that competition could force in the political makeup, as I saw. So I determined to create a two-party system. And the best vehicle at the time for doing that was the Republican Party. The Democrats had been in office since 1932, Roosevelt, 4 terms elected, and Truman elected in 48, and Eisenhower coming on as a very popular military hero who had the possibility of being nominated for president in 1952. And that popularity was very widespread in Virginia. So we had an opportunity to begin the construction of a real strong Republican Party that could form that vehicle for competition that I desired. It worked. We elected Eisenhower. My little group in Roanoke began to elect candidates or run candidates that never had competition before, first city council in the House of Delegates. We elected some, we lost some. We elected a congressman in 1952, whereas no Republican had ever been thought to have a chance to be elected. So they never ran a serious candidate. But we ran Dick Boff, a young fellow who conducted a serious campaign, knocked off an incumbent who had no idea that he could lose, but he did, against this competitive situation. So beginning there in 1952, we began to build a party in Virginia. In 1953, Ted Dalton, who was a state senator from Radford out in the western part of the state, very popular, very charismatic leader of the Republican Party, almost got elected in governor in 1953 against a Byrd candidate who did not have much charm, and without the active intervention of senior Senator Harry Byrd, when it began to appear that Ted might be elected, he jumped in because Ted advocated the issuance of bonds supported by gas tax revenue for construction of roads. Byrd couldn't stand the idea of any debt, couldn't stand the idea of governmental services, either for public education or roads or mental health. Just was anti-government, really. But he kept Ted Dalton from being elected governor in 1953. We took another shot at it in 1957 when we had a reasonable chance, again with Ted Dalton as the candidate, to elect a Republican as governor. But unfortunately for the Republican Party in 1953 or 57, it was necessary for Eisenhower to send troops to Little Rock to enforce the constitutional rights of minority citizens to attend public schools that they'd been denied in the past. And that created a reaction, an anti-reaction that was, you just can't believe how bad the reaction was in the South, throughout the South, but even in Virginia, which did not, fortunately, have the reputation for violence in opposition to government, some of the other states did. But it was bad. It was bad. It was complete segregation. In 1946, I remember stopping at a wayside outside of Pulaski, seeing a sign saying colored this way and white this way. Even after I was governor, there were signs, no, not after I was governor, because I would have stopped it, but even after I was practicing law, I represented a client in Pennsylvania County who was part of the minority. And when we went around during the quarter periods, lunchtime, to a glorified hot dog stand for lunch, we had to go around to the back if my client was black, and be served out the back window of the hot dog stand instead of going up to the counter the way white people were allowed to and encouraged to at that time. It was bad. And it was part of what I determined to overcome if there was any possibility of doing it. But to build a party, we were set back by Eisenhower's trip, sending the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army to assure admittance of those black kids to those colleges, to that high school. And yet we continued to build a party, and I continued on my quest, and actually moving over a few years, the ascendance of that conservative element of the Republican Party, which resulted in the nomination of an extremist at the time, Barry Goldwater, as candidate for President of the United States, created a situation that formed a good background for my election ultimately as governor. Goldwater was a great guy. I got to know him later. He wasn't nearly as extreme as he was painted, but he was painted as an extremist in 1964. And he was the pinnacle of what came later to be Southern strategy of the Republican Party. It was a white supremacy approach. And among other things, when he was nominated for president by the 1964 Republican Convention, one of the speeches bragged about that extremism by saying extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. What that meant was we're not going to take any moderate course for the Republican Party. We're going all the way to the right, and Goldwater is the symbol of that. Well, they put all their resources in it. Virginia was particularly strong and active in money and participation of people who had never participated in politics before. They became either Democrats for Goldwater or outright Republicans. They put everything they had into the election of Goldwater in Virginia, and they lost. Well, that created in Virginia a vacuum that existed after 1964 and dominated the thinking in Virginia as we approached the election of a governor in 1965. 65 was the year in which Mills Godwin was the shoe-in for governor. He had come up through the Democratic Party, touched all the bases, served all the party interests, even supported the Democratic candidate for President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, in 1964. Didn't do it very enthusiastically or very vociferously, but did get nominally on the list of having supported the National Party. So he was the nominee who was going to be governor, and there wasn't any doubt about it. The Republicans had to nominate against that background, and nobody was willing to come forward. We put everything we could into the 64 race, it was lost. What's the use? But I was the one who was encouraged somewhat by some of the staff people at the Republican National Committee and by our National Committee woman, a woman named Hazel Barger, who was the National Committee woman from Roanoke, to run for governor, and it fitted in what I wanted to do anyway, because my objective in life had been to be elected as governor of Virginia. And by that time, after Ted had lost twice, maybe I could be the first Republican governor. So I agreed to run in 1965. My purpose was then not to get elected. I was going to try, and I gave it everything I could. But I knew that beating Mills Godwin was an impossibility in view of his dominant status. But I knew that if I could get 35 to 40% of the vote, I would establish a name identification that would enable me, against possible opposition from the right wing of the Republican Party, to get the nomination for governor in 1969. And that's the way it worked out. I had a little interesting sidelight in 1965 on Eisenhower's participation, because I had a nice visit with Eisenhower in Gettysburg in the summer of 1965 after I had been nominated for the Republican candidate for governor, and I visited Eisenhower and I told him about having supported him when he sent the troops to Little Rock. And I did it, I said, because you were right, General, and I knew that that course, supporting the decision of the Supreme Court, and seeing that those kids got their constitutional rights, was absolutely necessary. And though I was running for the House of Delegates, and though your action was clearly going to defeat me in 1957 for the House of Delegates because of the wrath that it incurred by the establishment in Virginia, I supported you nonetheless because you were right. And in view of that, when I invited him to come down and campaign for me, his response was, well, I about quit campaigning in view of my age, but maybe in view of what you've told me about your race in 1957 for the House of Delegates, maybe I owe you one. So he came and did campaign for me. And his appearance and Nixon's appearance in 1965 were probably the only things of any outside influence that changed, that had any effect on that race anyhow. We spent a total of $60,000, and that's all, in the campaign for governor. And we spent $15 million on a race for governor. But I did get that 35 to 40%. I got more than that. I got 44% of the vote for governor. It did establish my name identification as a potential leader of the Republican Party. And it did, while I supported Nixon in the interim, to help continue to build the Republican Party in Virginia. In '68, I was the Middle Atlantic's campaign manager for Nixon's nomination in '68, and then the Middle Atlantic manager for his election in the general election. He offered to have me participate as a part of his administration, and my response to that was, Mr. President, I'd be glad to do anything you want me to do, but if you want my druthers, what I'd rather you do is support me for governor of Virginia next year in the governor's race. He did support me very vigorously. He called me practically every Sunday during the campaign to see how it was going. He came to Roanoke in Air Force One and had about the best political rally I've ever seen. Exactly 1 week before the election, helped us peak our campaign at exactly the right time. Made a marvelous speech, got everybody very excited, and we won. Jumping over to the busing and integration requirements that occurred during my term as governor. First, in my inaugural address, I called for Virginia to become a model of race relations. I asked for us to create an aristocracy of ability based on no consideration of race, color, or creed, but rather on merit. And made that speech, and then 9 months later, we were faced with the decrees which in August became final from the Supreme Court of the United States, requiring, based on the Green decision in Newton County, which you've studied, it required crosstown busing to actively mandate integration in the public schools rather than the simple elimination of discrimination, which was required by Brown against the Board of Education. So in August, my family and I, who lived in the executive mansion by then, were confronted with whether to send our kids to Mosby Middle School or Kennedy High School, which was the school to which we would have been assigned under the busing plans that were approved by Judge Marriage in the district court in Richmond, or to choose some other school in the city of Richmond, which we were permitted to do by the court and by the school board. The background for that was that they, the court and the school board, said the executive mansion is not part of the city of Richmond. Legally, it is Capitol Square, and that's not legally part of the city of Richmond. So since you're not part of the city of Richmond, you can choose any school you want for your kids to attend. Well, we thought about that and thought, what kind of a leadership example would that give if we picked some fancy school in the West End that was only partially integrated, or sent the children to the schools to which they would have been assigned if they had been subject to the court's decree. And our decision, 5 people, 3 of them, 11, 12, and 13 years old, and their parents. Our 4th child was only 5, so he really didn't enter into that decision, but 5 of us decided to take the position of leadership and to do what the court would have required if we had been subject to the court's decrees. Taylor went to Kennedy, Ann and Woody went to Mosby Middle School. Kennedy had 92% black participation in the school population, and Mosby had 96% black participation. When we went to football games at Kennedy High School, we could look down to see the cheerleaders, and they were about 10 or 12, and on either end was a little white dot, and a little white dot on the other end, and black dots all in between. One of the white dots was mine. Taylor was a cheerleader at Kennedy High School. They entered into complete participation in those schools and were determined to make integration, even though on a small scale, work if it was possible to do so. They got a great education both places. The Taylor graduated from Kennedy High School. She was a valedictorian. She went on to Dartmouth, where she graduated summa cum laude. She went to med school at Virginia and is a doctor now, practicing in Syracuse, New York, where she has 3 children. And her husband is a plastic surgeon who specializes in reconstruction of hands, injured hands. And she went to Princeton, graduated magna cum laude, went to Harvard Law School. She's a lawyer, a judge now at the juvenile court in the city of Richmond. Her husband is Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, Tim Kaine. I put in a plug for him to be elected governor in 2005 without any embarrassment. I commend him to you. And Woody, the third one of those who was in the integrated situation, went to Virginia, graduated with distinction, got his doctorate from Duke, is teaching at an institution called the University of Richmond. He was tenured there last month and loves it, and I know why. Dwight went, basically his public school education was in Northern Virginia after we moved up there, but he went to Brown and is a lawyer now after having been an assistant United States attorney in Brooklyn, where he prosecuted violent criminals. He's now in Portland, Oregon, where he's again an assistant United States attorney, and his wife is communications director for the governor of Oregon. Though I was a Republican, all of them are Democrats. And I insist that my sponsorship in Virginia throughout my political career has been to build a two-party system so that people would have a choice. And I say to everybody, you vote for the person you think would be best for the state, regardless of party label. And therefore, I don't have any compunctions about supporting the Democrats, as I've done with my delegate on the northern neck. Albert Pollard is Democrat delegate. John Chichester is Republican senator, and I supported those equally. And I will support Tim Kaine, the Democrat, for governor in 2005. It's been a lot of fun. It's been challenging at times, but very, very stimulating and invigorating. And I encourage all of you to participate in politics. And now that particularly we've gotten a two-party system where you do have a choice in Virginia. Now, it seems to me the choices today are pretty obvious. Now, you ask me questions. I'm glad to be here. And I want you to participate and see where you'd like me to go on these discussions. Okay, yes, sir.
All right. From what you said so far, it seems like you are pretty progressive.
I hope so.
Yeah, and in your political run. But like Robert Marriage, I heard you brought him up. He faced a lot of like hatred and backlash from the community. Did you ever feel any of that?
Yeah, like Bob, I ignored it. He did. He had it more focused way than I did. I was more protected living in the executive mansion. He was in a private home. He had to have marshals maintained in effect hard to protect him. And he did have death threats. I had some death threats. I guess that goes with the job. One time, Superintendent of State Police showed me a picture and said, "This is a lady who claims to have been one of your lady friends in the past, and she's threatening to kill you and saying that if nobody else can have you, if I can't have you, nobody else can have you either. She's going to kill you. Have you ever seen this woman?" Well, I said, "I hope not, because she was the worst looking thing you ever saw." Howard Carwile, who flip-flopped, he was a political personage here in Virginia, in Richmond. I think he was on the city council, wasn't he? Yeah, he was on city council, and he was a maverick member of city council. He also was elected House of Delegates on an integration platform and was supported by the Crusade for Voters, which also supported me. That was an organization to get out the black vote, very effective organization. And I think that was the time that Howard was supported by them, got elected in the House of Delegates, but he flip-flopped. And by the time busing came along, he was an outright white supremacist. He led a rally against school busing in the Capitol Square, in which he was quoted in a newspaper as saying, "When I think of the governor of Virginia," talking about me, "I think of euthanasia." So it was a pretty bad time. The feeling was very, very bad and universal almost. I told Brian that I went out to a rally in Chesterfield County of an organization that put itself together called Save Our Schools. This was when they were threatening to close the schools because of crosstown busing. And when we went out in the limousine with trooper driving, and as we turned into the school parking lot, there was a crowd around demonstrating, protesting the group that was going to accept integration rather than close the schools. And they were shaking their fists at me in the back seat. My reaction was to turn the light on so they could see me and give them a big wave. But there was pretty bad animosity at times, but there was never any serious violence, except, as I remember, on one occasion, the police in Danville in 1963, that was before my time, had used dogs and fire hoses against preachers and others who were carrying out protests against some form of discrimination in that early period. And that was bad, very bad, but I think nobody was fatally injured at least. And we had a minimum of violence in Virginia, though the feeling was pretty universal against any integration from the beginning. Their password was, well, you can't have a little bit of integration, that's like being a little bit pregnant. And it was, the establishment responded to bad leadership provided by Senator Harry Byrd and missed a great opportunity. If they had said, as Virginia could have said in the Civil War, we won't secede, they missed that opportunity. They could have said, with respect to immigration, we will comply with the law. But instead they went through that period of massive resistance, which is a bad taint in the discussion of Virginia. I fortunately was able to turn it around to some extent because the picture of Taylor and me going to Kennedy High School, which appeared first on the front page of the New York Times and became a symbol for my administration, also became a symbol for the proposition that Virginia will comply with the Constitution of the United States and the law, as juxtaposed against George Wallace and Orville Barbas, who was governor of Arkansas, and Ross Barnett, who was governor of Mississippi, and that crazy guy who was a contemporary of mine, the governor of Georgia, who said he was going to use a pickaxe to get any black person out of his restaurants. We were different. We were complying with the law, and that picture symbolized the proposition that we would comply with the law, and I'm proud to have had a part of that. It was a great opportunity for me. Other questions? Come on, don't hold back. Yep.
I do have a question. You mentioned how you're an advocate for the two-party competition. What do you think about a third or fourth party in America? Like for America's history, we've only had two strong parties. What do you think the likelihood of a third party ever coming to be forced to be reckoned with?
Well, it can happen. It happened with the creation of the Republican Party in 1856 and 60, but it is very difficult. All the laws are based on two parties. For example, in Virginia, the whole election machinery, the secretariat and the electoral boards throughout the state are based on two parties. The composition of those boards now must be a majority of the party of the governor and must have a representation on the boards of the minority party. And there are other laws, financing and otherwise, that encourage just two parties. Tradition encourages just two parties. It could happen, but more likely is the experience of the Green Party that has come close to becoming a permanent organization, but really kind of falls apart when the chips are down. It'd be tough, and the merits of just two parties as opposed to a multi-party situation are very appealing. France had a bad experience immediately post-World War II of multi-parties when it really destabilized the government. And there wasn't any stable government of France for a long period of time because of this multi-party situation. So I'm a great two-party man. I kind of hope it doesn't happen, but I do want to be sure that you maintain two strong parties so that ultimately the moderates will out, they'll win. extremists can't survive competitive situations for very long. Yes, who's next? Some of you ladies. All right, some of you men. I never saw a college group that was so reticent.
You said a few times that you had some experiences with the birds. Those are some politicians we studied more than a few times in class. What impressions did you have from them, and what experiences did you have with them?
With the birds, I knew Harry Jr. very well. He's basically a contemporary of mine, and a very charming person. Did not know his dad. His dad died when I was running for governor in 1965. Well, died right after my campaign in 1965. But I met Harry when I was campaigning in Winchester. During that campaign, his father was comatose, really, I think, by that time. But Harry, I knew about him. He was a strong figure in the leadership for massive resistance when he was in the Senate. He was also a strong leader for minimum governmental services in Virginia. Instead of applying funds that were collected in taxes to needs like the needs of the mentally ill or education, he sponsored and was successful for a time in passing legislation that required that surpluses, which could have been used to meet needs, were refunded to income taxpayers in Virginia. So he was a leader in that no government segment of Virginia politics. And then when the massive resistance came along, he was a leader in putting together the almost majority that almost voted to close the schools rather than to accept any integration. The vote in the Senate to keep the schools open was 20 in favor of keeping the schools open and 19 opposed to keeping the schools open. And Harry Byrd was one of those 20. So I never had much respect for his political thinking and advocacy. But as an individual, he's a nice fella and personable, and he and I've always gotten along very nicely, though we recognize the difference in our philosophy. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I appreciate it.
Lindsay Allman was another one of the crowd that got elected with Byrd's support. He changed. I think he never, basically, he grew up in Orange County, which is Piedmont, Virginia, and practiced law in Roanoke, which is Western Virginia. He never was tainted with the slavery tradition that the Byrds adopted. They weren't in the slavery situation either, but they adopted the philosophy of the white supremacists to an degree. But Allman never did really, and he just went along with them to get elected governor in 1957. But he was an orator who got very enthusiastic in his speeches. And he's the author of the campaign speech that I heard in Roanoke. I'd rather lose my right arm than to see one Negro child admitted to the white schools of Virginia. That was a campaign speech by Ken for governor of Virginia. And that was a Byrd candidate. That epitomized their thinking. Yet he had sense enough to reverse himself when he saw what it was going to do economically to Virginia to close the schools. And without his reversal, the schools might well have been closed for a while. They wouldn't have stayed closed, but they might have been closed more than they were in those token places like Prince Edward and Norfolk and Warren County, where the were schools closed for a very short period of time. he also told me that, I asked him one time if the news reports were true, that the senior senator of Virginia refused to accept the telephone call from the governor of Virginia, sitting governor, when he knew that that governor was going to call him to tell him that I've got to reverse and I'm not going to support massive resistance any longer. I'm going to support keeping the schools open. Senator Byrd knew that call was, what that call was about, and he refused to accept the call from the governor of Virginia, which I think is one of the most petty occurrences that has occurred in Virginia history. But he did it.
Anybody else have I have one question. Go ahead, Virginia.
I was just wondering what some of your experiences with like racism growing up as a child and like what your parents felt about the whole issue.
My experiences growing up were part of why I'm what I am today, of course. And I began to be aware of the race, what was then problem, probably still problem, challenge, I like to call it, from a very early time. Two of my close friends were Elmer Miller and Kenneth Simpson. They were black, and we were dear friends until about the 6th or 7th grade, when they were trundled off in a bus if they wanted to go to high school 3 miles away, a little more than think about today as a trip, but they had to go in a bus to a consolidated black school if they wanted to go to high school. And that was the separation. You got to the age of puberty, you're no longer socialized with black people. They were maids, partners, servants. That was the attitude. But those were two close friends of mine. Another close friend was Carrie Porter, who was a high school girl whom my parents hired to, in effect, babysit with us. She was a black teenager. She was a dear friend. And we used to go to the movies with her, but we had to go upstairs and sit in the gallery because black people weren't allowed to sit in the main auditorium. One of my mentors was a man named John Cloud, who was a factotum for the former congressman in that district. He was cook, gardener, bottle washer, very wise person, and helped me with my gardening experiences. I raised and sold chickens and sweet corn when I was in high school. John helped me with both of those endeavors. John was a close friend. John said to me one day, I hate to use these words, but I'm going to quote him. He was talking about a friend of ours who had slighted him in some way, and he said, Linwood, I know I'm a nigger, but and went on. And that hurt me to the quick. And those experiences have carried me forward and made me recognize what a challenge it was to overcome this period of generations of discrimination and relegation to an inferiority status of a major minority group, the African American citizens of this country. And my parents, well, they were a little different generation, and they had different ideas about potential of black citizens. My father was born in 1879 on a cotton plantation in South Georgia, and that was not too far removed from the period of slavery. And his attitude was that black people are inferior by definition, but he was willing to listen. My mother never got over what she could refer to in the Bible as hewers of wood and drawers of water, which to her was allocation by the God of black people to be in an inferior status. And then she wasn't really willing to listen, like Dad was, but this was just a question of background and growing up in a different era. And it did not affect me. I was, in my first experiences with black professionals was in law school when I was at Harvard. And we formed a team to participate in what was called the Ames competition. It was a tournament style conduct of appellate court cases. And we won each round up to the finals. And were defeated by a marvelous presentation by the lead advocate on the other side of the team that was our opponent in the finals before a Supreme Court justice. And he was a black guy from Baltimore. And it just reinforced my thinking that black people are no different from anybody else. They need to be given the opportunity that we've neglected, that we've kept from them. And they'll shine just like everybody else. And that certainly has been proved by our experience in my generation. And leaves it to you all to continue. If you think there's not still need for it, go to any church on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock and count the minorities in that congregation. If it's a white church, it's all white. If it's a black church, it's all black. And there's something wrong. It still segregates us, even in our religion. What else? You have a question.
I think we'll take one last question. I can speak with you more afterwards. Please.
I just wanted to know if you were in support of affirmative action.
Yes. Yes, I think it's a step toward accomplishing the complete integration that I want to see occur. Housing was another one that through the years I've supported, integrated housing. There's an organization in Richmond called Home Housing Opportunities Made Equal. And that began an integrated housing here near the University of Richmond in about 1970 that demonstrated that values don't go down when you have an integrated neighborhood there, they go up. And that turned housing around. It used to be if a black person moved into the block, all the white people got white fright and moved out. And it destroyed values. That's a bad part of our past. But this home demonstration here near the University of Richmond began a change that got to be a model for housing integration that's still a model for how it ought to be. The north side is now well integrated. My daughter and son and son-in-law went to the north side because they wanted to live in an integrated neighborhood. Values over there have gone up because of that. These are challenges that still exist. You all are accepting of challenges.
Thank you very much.
Please.
Yeah.
Thank you.